I now just manage it. So I don't deny myself bread. I have bread every day. This is the joy for me. I love bread.
So do I. And so do you, probably. I'm assuming that's why you clicked on this video. That is what we like to call finding common ground. Sorry about that admittedly old and overused clip of Oprah. I've always wanted to be able to have an excuse to use it, so I'm cashing in now. I'm assuming that you guys were on TikTok or at least on the internet a little bit when the pandemic started, and everyone started picking up quarantine hobbies. We had roller skating, we had that foamy coffee, crocheting, and we had sourdough bread. The obsession with sourdough and sourdough starters kind of kickstarted a long-standing obsession with bread and making bread in general that we still see 2 years later. I've said this multiple times, but bread is one of my absolute favorite things to make and one of my favorite things to talk about and to research. So naturally, I also had a sourdough starter at the beginning of 2020 that I maintained for roughly 6 months. Then I got busy and it died, which probably does not bode well for my credibility in this video, I suppose. And so now that everybody is making bread, everybody is making bread content and researching bread and stuff like that. And a lot of people have come to the conclusion that bread is really hard to make. And I agree, but also disagree. Bread in itself is not hard to make. Bread at its core is only a few ingredients. You just need flour, water, salt, and yeast. Mush those ingredients around for a little bit, pop it in the oven, and you'll have a loaf of bread. But the point of artisanal bread baking and the craft of it, and what you see a lot on Instagram and stuff, is people learning what is happening inside that process and within that process, and how to kind of manipulate the ingredients and how they're treated to get the loaf of bread that you want. I will not be talking about sourdough bread today. It is admittedly not something that I am super well versed in, not something that I'm good at. There are plenty of people on YouTube who are really good at sourdough bread. Today's video is gonna be a lot longer than my other videos and a lot more in depth, because I really kind of wanna go into bread baking in general and kind of explain things that I think people are missing or misunderstanding, and explain how and why bread baking works the way it does. And my goal is that you would walk away from this video being able to see any recipe, any bread recipe that you want to make, and be able to understand what's going on and how to adapt and be able to get the loaf of bread that you want. I can give you as many recipes as I want, and you can look at as many recipes as you want, but until you know kind of the baker's instincts and the how and the why and stuff like that, you might not be as successful as you otherwise would be. So that's what I'm here for today. And if you stick around to the end of this video, I will be giving you guys a really solid, really good beginner-friendly demi baguette recipe. If you kind of want to skip the fluff and you're like, I've already made a couple of loaves of bread, I don't really want to hear you talk about it all, you can skip to this time card. This is where the recipe will be, so you can just skip here. No hard feelings, I swear. I will not be, I'll only be I'll be a little sad. I'll admit it. I'll be a little bit sad, but it's fine, I guess, whatever. Lastly, I just want to put out there that I am in no way claiming to be the be-all end-all or even a complete expert on bread baking. However, I do make it for my job every single day. I was fortunate enough to be taught by some really talented people and to be given a lot of really good resources. I do know a little bit, and I just kind of want to share with you guys what I know. Without further ado, let's get started. We're gonna go through not a specific bread recipe, but we're gonna go through kind of the structure of any bread recipe that you might look at from beginning to end. And I'm gonna be kind of vague when it comes to certain things so that you can apply them to different kinds of bread, if that makes sense. You'll see in a second. There are breads that you can make in less than an hour. There are some really, really good quick breads like zucchini breads and Irish soda breads and stuff like that. There's a lot of really, really good breads that you can make in a very short amount of time. And the reason why those don't take as long is because they use raising agents or leaveners that are fast acting. They don't require much to activate. Usually it's like moisture or heat that they require to activate. It's less so much time. Yeast needs time. It needs time to work its magic. It needs time to do what it's got to do. So bread, good bread, will likely take you multiple hours. But how can bread be improved upon? Like, what makes good bread? For me, I like something with a good chew to it, something that's not like super dry and crumbly, something that like fights back a little bit when I bite into it. And those kind of breads usually come from a dough that has a higher hydration in it or more water. I also like a bread with a really nice developed crust. It has a gorgeous color on it, something that like really makes a mess when I cut into it. And I also look for bread that has a really good flavor to it because, like, of course I would. Wonder Bread has its merits, but you never really hear it being used as a compliment to anybody, you know? So let's start with chew and flavor, because those are two things that you can control before the baking, like in the mixing. I said something about hydration level, and you might have heard other bakers mention it before. You know, you might hear somebody say like, oh, what hydration level is that bread at? Oh, mine's at 70. Basically, people are talking about the amount of water in a dough in terms of baker's percentages. Baker's percentages are a way of kind of comparing the ingredients in a recipe by weight. So your flour is your main ingredient. That is most of what's in this recipe. It will always be 100%. If we're talking about how much water there is in a recipe, you would take water divided by flour, and that would give you the percentage of water in that recipe, or the hydration level. So if there is 300 grams of flour in a recipe and 300 grams of water in a recipe, that means that 300 divided by 300, that's 100% hydration, that's 100% water. That'd be a very high hydration dough. If you all of a sudden have 300 grams of flour and 200 grams of water, that would be about a 66% hydration. That would be 66% water. The ratio of water to flour is 66%. If you're at 150, you lose another 50 grams of water, so it's 150 grams of water and 300 grams of flour. That means you're at a 50% hydration, which means you're starting to get into the lower end of hydration, if that makes sense. A higher hydration dough would be somewhere between 70% and 100% hydration. Those would be like ciabatta, or, you know, some baguettes, or sourdough is typically a higher hydration dough. The higher the hydration level, the more open the crumb structure in a bread dough is. Like, the more holes you get and the more open holes you get, it has more of a chew to it, and it has a different kind of flavor than something with a lower hydration. A lower hydration dough would be, you know, between 50 and like 60%-ish. That's a lower hydration dough. Typically these doughs are more beginner friendly. They're easier to work with, but they have a closer, drier crumb structure to it. This is the tip of the iceberg with baker's percentages. A really good way to kind of keep track of recipes and compare recipes, and make changes to recipes. The recipe that I give you guys at the end will be one of the very few recipes that I give that does not have any cups in it or anything. I will only be giving you guys the measurements of the ingredients by weight. And that's because with bread, the ratios and proportions are very important, and the most accurate way to measure out ingredients when it comes to this is by weight. Everybody measures a cup of flour differently, but 100 grams will always be 100 grams will always be 100 grams. Have you ever thought about what bread tastes like? Like when you eat it, and I asked you, like, what do you like about the taste of bread? Would you be able to tell me? I'm listening. If not, then I honestly don't think you've had really good bread. Bread can sometimes be rich and sweet and luxurious. Sometimes it can be a little sour and acidic. Sometimes it's yeasty and full-bodied, and sometimes if you mess up the recipe, It tastes like beer. A lot of times how your bread tastes and the flavor of it comes from the type of flour that you're using, where you get it, the method of fermentation, and how much time you give to fermentation. So let's talk about the last two, because I think those are the easiest for everybody to control. Sourdough gets its, typical sour taste from a levain that is made from a starter that is taken care of and fed over weeks and weeks and months and sometimes years. The longer you give yeast to kind of work its magic and ferment, the more of a dynamic and complex flavor that you'll get. But again, we're not talking about sourdough today. We're talking about breads that use commercial yeast, which is usually what you'd find in those little like Fleischmann's packets at the grocery store. If you go straight into using commercial yeast, and you don't really give it any extra time aside from the mixing and the baking, you're going to miss out on a lot of those really complex and deep flavors that you would get in a bread like a sourdough. However, it takes a long time to get to that point that a sourdough would be at. And not all of us have that time to be taking care of something every single day if you're not going to be making bread every single day. However, there is sort of a middle ground, I guess, and that is pre-ferments. I could do, again, an entire video on pre-ferments alone and the different kinds of pre-ferments and when you'd use them. There are 4 main types of pre-ferments that you might see people talking about. There is poolish, biga, pat fermentee, and sponge. But again, for brevity, we're just gonna be talking about one that I think is a lot more common, and one that I'm gonna be using in the recipe later, and that is a poolish. Basically, a pre-ferment is a mixture of flour, water, and a little bit of yeast, whether that be naturally occurring or that be commercial yeast. And you either get that by mixing it together beforehand or by taking it from an already established dough. This mixture of flour, water, and yeast has given the yeast a head start and has given the yeast more time to start fermenting and to start developing those flavors. Poolishes are not necessary in any bread recipe, but they greatly improve dough strength, dough extensibility, and dough flavor. It doesn't really take any time or effort, just like a little bit of forethought, but adding a pre-ferment will improve your bread greatly. So I personally think that it's always a good idea. There's still yeast in the final dough because the poolish itself will not be strong enough or won't have fermented long enough to support the dough by itself completely. So the next supremely beneficial but largely overlooked step in bread making that is super helpful is the use of an autolyse. So an autolyse is basically when you mix just the flour and the water together first, just those 2 ingredients, and let them sit for a little bit before adding the rest of the ingredients. Letting them sit together for a little bit helps to give the dough a head start on gluten development and cuts down mixing time later. This is especially beneficial if you are mixing bread dough by hand. Honestly, it's kind of cool to watch because when you first mix, the flour and the water together, it'll look like a weird, shaggy, almost dry mess. It won't look cohesive. It won't look like an identifiable bread dough. But then when you cover it and you let it sit for a little bit, usually about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how hot it is in your kitchen. And then when you come back, the dough will have changed a lot. It will be less dry and it'll start to look a little elastic. And when you pull on the dough, it'll stretch as opposed to just breaking. And then you can add everything else. So your poolish and your yeast first, and then your salt. Salt is very important in a bread recipe. Trust me, I have made enough loaves of bread in my life that did not have the salt in them, and you can absolutely tell when the salt is missing. You can absolutely, just by visuals, not only does salt bring out all of the flavor in a bread dough, but it also tightens the gluten strands and controls those, and it controls yeast activeness, I guess. So now that all the ingredients are in the bowl, you get to knead it. If you have a stand mixer, you can use that. If you don't, that is totally fine, because you don't need a stand mixer to make bread, which is fun. You're gonna have to work your dough a little bit, when you make bread. to develop the gluten and to really give it the strength to hold on to the air and the gas that is going to be produced by the yeast later on down the line. That's why you need gluten. That's why everyone talks about gluten, is because, do I have any balloons? Hold on, we're gonna get visual aids here. Okay, so I'm gonna, this is gonna be so dumb. I'm gonna use a balloon to demonstrate to you. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys like what gluten actually does in bread. I've said like gluten like 80 times already in this video, but I haven't actually explained what gluten is. So basically you get gluten when you mix flour and water together. Just always flour and any kind of moisture, gluten forms, gluten develops. And basically what gluten does and why you have to work to get gluten and control it is because you're working to be able to hold on to the gases that the yeast will produce later on down the line. So this balloon is a network of gluten, right? This balloon, I kneaded my bread like crazy. This is the gluten that I worked to develop, okay? The air that's in here now is a product of the yeast. It ate all the sugar that was in the flour and the carbs and stuff like that, and it literally just like farted out gas, okay? And if you work your gluten correctly and it's strong enough, it will hold on to it, and that's what gives you a nice big loaf of bread. If your gluten is not strong and it's weak and it's riddled with holes and it tears, it won't hold on to anything. So that's what gluten is. That wasn't even in my script. I just kind of wanted to show you guys that. So hopefully that makes sense. So if you're working with a higher hydration dough, kneading your dough is gonna look a little differently than just like, the straightforward pulling and kneading and stuff. And in some cases, you don't really need to do that in general. I could give you a number. I could say, yeah, knead your dough for 5 minutes and it will be done. But there's like a lot of factors that go into every single process of bread baking that change what you're gonna have to do. So it's just gonna be easier for me to tell you the signs, to tell you how to know that your bread dough is done and it's ready to go. So here's what you're looking for when you're kneading your bread, and here's how you know that it is done. Your ball of dough should be smoother, less lumpy, and more of a cohesive mass. It will probably still be a little tacky, but it shouldn't be like a sticky, like goopy mess. So when you pull on it, it should stretch a little bit. It shouldn't just break. If you have all those things, then your bread dough is properly developed and you can stop kneading it. If you're using a stand mixer, this could take less time. It could take like 4 minutes, 3 minutes. If you are doing it by hand, maybe it'll take 10 minutes. If you used an auto lease, maybe it'll take 5 minutes. I don't know, I'm not in your kitchen. But if you keep those like little signs in mind, it should be pretty easy to tell. So your dough is mixed and it is ready for its kind of first bout of fermentation, and that is bulk fermentation. Basically, bulk fermentation is when no matter how many loaves of bread you're making, whether it's 1 or 20, the entire mass of dough just sits together and relaxes all together as a group. During this time, your gluten will start to relax, like I said, right? Because you just like kneaded the crap out of it, and it's just like really, really tense and like really strung out and like really stressed, and like there's a lot going on and stuff. So you're just gonna give it like some time to just like, like calm down, release the tension in the shoulders, relax, and just like vibe, You just wanna chill for a little bit, maybe like 40 minutes or so. It's not a big deal. But if you do your bulk fermentation for too long and you let your gluten relax too much, it will start to just break down. So basically, sometimes you'll see during these bulk fermentations that there are a series of folds that break up the fermentation. It's like strength training for your gluten. You're working it, you're getting it stronger without overworking it, and you're just kind of controlling the development. So a lot of times, in sourdough, you'll see it's once every hour for 4 hours. Sometimes in certain recipes, it's just once halfway through. It really depends on the hydration of the dough and kind of what you're looking for in the final loaf. So after bulk fermentation is done, we can move on to portioning, shaping, stuff like that into its individual loaves. So go ahead and divide it up into however many loaves you're making, and then you're gonna pre-shape it. Bread comes in lots of shapes and sizes, right? Some of those shapes and sizes are a little too much for the gluten to handle all at once. So people will do what is called a pre-shape. Basically, you are portioning the dough and getting the dough to like the halfway point in between unportioned, just cut dough and the final shape. You know, sometimes you'll see it in like a little log if you're making a baguette. Sometimes you'll see it in just like a regular round shape. Whatever bread recipe you're looking at will tell you what pre-shape you want to get it into, but that is why you pre-shape it. You let it sit for like 15 minutes, maybe, if that, and then you can get it into the final shape that it needs to be in. If you're making something like a baguette where the final shape is drastically different from the pre-shape, because you know you're rolling it out to like typically like at least twice the size of the pre-shape, sometimes if the gluten is not relaxed enough, it'll start to shrink back into, you know, its original size. If you see that happening, just let it sit for like another 5 minutes and then try to roll it out again, and you should be good. And after you get it shaped, it's time for the final proof. Again, this is something where a recipe will likely give you a duration or like a length of time, but a lot of times it's easier to just look for the signs to know when it's done proofing. So I will give you those. It should have visibly relaxed a little bit. You know, I'm not saying that it should have completely flattened out into a puddle, but it should not be as like tight and taut as it was before. It should kind of have mellowed out a little bit, and it should be a little puffy. You know, it probably won't have doubled in size, but it should have a little bit of jiggle in it, because that's the gas. That means that the yeast is doing, you know, what it's got to do. You know, remember the balloon? That means the yeast has done its job and there's gas in your dough. And the last thing you want to do is poke your dough. So if you poke your dough lightly with just your finger and the dough springs back like really, really quickly, that means that the gluten hasn't relaxed enough and it needs more time to proof. If you poke it and your entire dough collapses, that means there was too much gas in your dough and it was overproofed. And I cannot help you there. It is what it is, just bake it at that point. But if you poke it and it starts to, you know, the indent starts to spring back just a little bit, and it maybe doesn't even spring back all the way, that means the gluten has relaxed enough and you are at the perfect time to bake it. The final proof is also a really good time to develop some good flavor, because like I said, the final proof is the yeast kind of doing its magic. So a lot of times you'll see, like in a sourdough, you'll see a room temperature proof for like an hour or so, and then you have a really long, slow ferment in the fridge overnight. Putting it in the fridge is a way to develop a lot of dynamic flavor without letting the yeast kind of overact and overproof your dough, because cold makes yeast sleepy. It makes it very slow and sluggish, which, like, you know, same. It is super, super important to keep humidity in mind when you are proofing your dough. And here's why. It's winter, right? And it's really cold and your skin gets really dry. Like your knuckles get really dry in your hands, right? And you go to like make a fist, and when your knuckles pop out right here, like the skin just like cracks and breaks, you know? We don't want that. If you are a human, you put lotion on to keep your skin elastic and pliable, so when you move it, it doesn't crack. If you're bread, you just kind of want your environment to be humid so that, you know, the bread does not develop a skin on top, something that's just like kind of dry. Because you want your bread to be able to relax and puff up a little bit without cracking or breaking or anything like that. There's a couple things you can do. You can just kind of cover it in plastic wrap, because your bread should have moisture in it. There is water in the dough after all. You can put your bread in an off oven and just spray it down a little bit. I just find that sometimes just putting a towel over your bread in the final proof is not good enough. And my dough still ends up being really dry. So just kind of check on it periodically throughout the final proof and make sure that it's not getting too dry. You can spray it down with some water. There's a lot of things you can do. It's finally time to bake the damn thing, okay? I know that you've gone through all of this and you're like, fucking finally, all right? This is the quickest process of the entire thing, but don't get lazy on me, okay? Hey, pay attention. There's still lots to do, all right? I like to start preheating my oven while my bread is in its final proofing stage because bread bakes at a very high temperature. So you wanna really, really make sure that your oven is completely up to temp before you put any bread inside because it needs that initial like shock of hot air in order to bake correctly. Before you bake your bread, a lot of recipes will have you score your bread, which is when you it's like those artful little slashes that you put in. Do you have to score the bread? No. Do you have to do any of this? But believe it or not, there is like a reason for scoring the bread. It is aesthetics. It is because bread just looks pretty when you score it and you can put pretty designs in it and you can go crazy and it's nice. But also your bread is going to break itself. Essentially, your bread is going to rip and develop a seam somewhere. So you might as well tell it where to do that. And believe it or not, there is like a method to scoring. It isn't just like going up and down. If you score your bread just up and down like this, your bread will just go sideways. You know, if you score your bread at kind of like a 35 to 40 degree angle-ish, instead of going sideways, it forces your bread upwards and you get that kind of like lovely ear that you see on a lot of like professional loaves of bread. So if you can score that way, try to. A lot of times you'll see people use what's called a lame, which is basically just like a razor blade on a stick. If you don't have a lame, a razor blade, just a plain razor blade is fine. If you don't have a plain old razor blade, a very sharp serrated knife is fine. I will take whatever you've got. So, you know, whatever you do, move quickly and confidently, and that is how you'll get the prettiest like score marks on your bread. Do you remember that whole thing about like your bread while it's proofing not developing a skin? The same thing pretty much applies here. Your bread has air in it and gas in it. When gas gets hot, gas expands. Big gas means big bread, but not if there's a skin on top of your bread. Basically, the reason why people bake bread in Dutch ovens or put ice at the bottom of the oven or spray water inside the oven or whatever to get steam inside of the oven is because you want a crust on your bread. You want a thick, beautiful, nice, craggly crust on your bread, but you don't want it too quickly because then your bread won't get as big and beautiful as it could otherwise. Professional bakers use steam injected ovens. We are not them. I just spray water into my oven, close the door really fast and hope for the best. If you're making sourdough using a Dutch oven and with a lid on, will trap the moisture that is already present in your dough. Some people put ice on the bottom of the oven. There's a lot of different things you can do. After all of that, you're finally ready to bake. So hopefully whatever recipe that you are using has accurate bake times. Obviously, something like a baguette won't take nearly as long as like a round boule would. Don't be afraid to get like a really nice, dark, rich color on your bread. A nice dark crust means that all of the sugars have caramelized properly and you're gonna get like a nice flavor and a nice chew on your crust, so don't be afraid of that. Don't burn it either though. When your bread is done and it comes out of the oven, you might see people knocking on the bottom of the bread. Here's a baguette that I made. This is a demi baguette, so it's like a small baguette. If you see people like knocking on the, can you hear that? It sounds hollow, right? That means that it is hopefully not dense and, you know, muddy and raw inside and it's full of air. Otherwise, if you're using a thermometer and you're temping your bread is cooked at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. I do not know what that is in Celsius. I am sorry. Another really fun thing to look for when you're baking bread is like a popping sound. If you pull your bread out and you put it on like a cooling rack or something and you hear these like tiny little like crackles or like tiny little pop sounds, that is actually a good thing. Basically, when hot things start to cool down, they shrink. But if your crust is like properly developed, if it tries to shrink, it's like hard, right? So it will crack. And you'll hear like kind of like a Rice Krispies snap crackle pop-esque you know, it's kind of cool. So next time you make bread, like listen to it, you know, it should have a little crackle to it. It's always fun. Lastly, you might see this in a bread recipe, and I want to explain it really quickly. Wait until your bread is fully cooled to cut into it. Please, please, please. If you really want warm bread, you can heat it up again later, but when it comes out of the oven, wait for it to cool before you cut into it. Basically, you want to give the insides of the bread a chance to set up and harden. If you cut into it immediately, you could just crush everything inside and destroy everything inside. Also, there is still a little bit of steam inside the bread probably, and if you cut into it, all the steam will just escape into the air rather than escaping inside the bread. So if you cut into it prematurely, your bread could be a little dry, and then, you know, you've made bread. I love making bread. I know it sounds like a really long and like arduous process, and like why would anybody do that if they could just go to the store and pick up a loaf of bread? You know that look on people's faces when you tell them that the amazing thing that they have in their mouths currently is like something that you made? Their jaw is on the floor when you tell them that about bread. Also for me, it's like a calming thing. Bread takes a lot of time, but it's not a lot of active time. It's a lot of just inactive time and waiting. So if I'm home one day and I have nothing to do, or if I'm home one day and I'm like really anxious and stressed, it gives me something to kind of like keep an eye on and think about over a long period of time. And then at the end, you know, very few ingredients made me something that would like sustain me, which is really cool. And it's also cool because once you understand how to make bread, you can make anything. I have been working on this specific recipe for literal weeks. It has kept me up. I have so much goddamn bread in my kitchen right now because I've just been recipe testing like crazy, trying to develop a recipe for you guys that would be easy to do at home without any special equipment. It doesn't require like a stand mixer or, you know, a special baking contraption or anything. It's all stuff that you probably have in the house. It makes 2 decently sized demi baguettes. To give one away to a friend or freeze one. Bread freezes and reheats really well. So the recipe, like in its full, will be on my website, on my blog, which I'll link down below. But I did promise it, so here is a visual step-by-step guide on how to make baguettes at home. So you're going to start by mixing together your bread flour and your water. Just give that a good mix. If you feel like it is a little too dry, you can go ahead and add a splash of water. Just keep an eye on it. You don't want to add too much. Once it comes together, it's going to look like a shaggy mess. That's all right. Go ahead and cover it for its autolyse. This will take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. And you'll know it's done when it is much more elastic, the flour has absorbed all of the water, it's super stretchy, and you're ready to add the rest of the ingredients. So first, go ahead and add your poolish from the day before. It should be bubbly and super active. And then you can add the rest of your yeast. I just kind of used pinching and folding motions to mix the poolish and the yeast in. If you're using a stand mixer, obviously this is going to be a little bit different, but you can totally do this by hand and you'll have no problem. Once the pre-ferment and the yeast are pretty much all mixed in, you can go ahead and add your salt and continue on with those pulling and folding motions, really working the dough and developing the gluten until your dough is ready. So it should be stretchy and soft, and it should not be nearly as sticky as it was when you started, but it should still be slightly tacky. This could take anywhere from 4 minutes to 10 minutes, depending on how long your autolyse was for, and depending on if you're doing this by hand or in a stand mixer. So again, you're looking for a good stretch without tearing. That means that the gluten is all formed and strong enough, and you can go ahead and cover that and leave it for bulk fermentation. Halfway through bulk fermentation, go ahead and do the stretch and fold. So I'd pull on each side of the dough and fold it in on itself. You want to pull pretty far without tearing the dough entirely. And once you've done that, folded the dough in on itself enough times, go ahead and cover it back up and leave it for the rest of its bulk fermentation. After bulk fermentation is complete, you're going to dump your dough out onto a well-floured surface. Just kind of let it fall so you don't tear the dough too much. Split it in half because this does make 2 demi baguettes, or I guess you can make one really big one if you want, but you're going to totally degas and flatten out each piece and then fold the dough in on itself really, really tightly. This is going to be your baguette pre-shape. If something is way too sticky, don't be afraid to flour it. It's better to flour it too much than to have your dough stick on itself. Give it a good 15-20 minute bench rest, and then you're ready to roll the baguettes out into their final shape. You pretty much just want this as long as your baking tray will allow it to be. And then go ahead and cover in plastic wrap and leave it for its long final proof. This will take anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. If you poke your dough with your finger and the dent comes up really fast and disappears right away, your dough is not ready. So go ahead and leave it for maybe another 20 minutes. But if you poke your dough and the dent comes up slowly and maybe doesn't even go away entirely, that means your dough is properly fermented and you're ready to bake. So for me personally, I like to spray my dough down. It puts a little bit of moisture on the outside and helps with steam and crust development. I also put flour on, but that's purely for aesthetics. I'm using a lam in this video, so it's essentially a razor blade on a stick, and the stick gives it that curved shape. And then score your dough. This bread is going to bake at 450 degrees. Go ahead and spray some water in the oven before you close the oven door, or put some ice on the bottom if you have that available to you. Either one works. And the bread will bake for roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Go ahead and rotate it halfway through, but you're just looking for that gorgeous golden brown color.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Like I said, I know that it took a while for me to get it out, but this is something that I'm really passionate about and something that I was really excited to do. So hopefully you guys understand bread a little bit better, and hopefully you see that bread is like time consuming and like a little bit tricky, but like it's not really that hard. If you have any questions for me, leave them down below, but I will see you guys in the next video.